Hello, and welcome to this instalment of Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And today's painting is Edward Manet's A Bar at the Folies Bergère. Hi everyone, and if I can just get out the picture, that is what we're going to be looking at. And it's an immensely rich painting. And shortly I'll get my, as I always say, my ugly fizzog out the way, and I'll let you contemplate in depth. And while I'll give you a decent amount of time to look at it in detail on your own, and then I'm going to read you a couple of quotes which describe some of the social context when this was painted. And then throughout the talk, I'll also give some literary references from memory. Guy de Maupassant, his novel Bel Ami, and there's Zola. Émile Zola, his two works. One is Le Ventre de Paris, The Belly of Paris. Le Ventre de Paris, sorry, The Belly of Paris. And there is another one called Au Bonheur des Dames, which I think was translated into English as Ladies' Paradise. I think literally it's to the happiness of ladies. And I think they give some great, all those references give some great context to what you're seeing now. So without more ado, I'll get out your way. Now, the first thing I'm going to read for you is an excerpt from Georg Simmel, who was a famous sociologist, and he wrote an essay in 1903 called The Metropolis and Mental Life. And it may sound odd to us, but remember, this painting was 1881. It was painted, and I described before, I gave a brief analysis in the Hollow Men video I did about the Haussmannization of the boulevards in Paris and the emergence of cities like Paris, London, Vienna as huge metropoles. But this is a very early essay, a very influential essay. And for us modern, in our era, 2024, at the time of filming, everyone's used to living in a city. The vast majority of people, it doesn't seem unusual at all. But remember, this was historically quite a new phenomenon to the degree to which these cities had suddenly rapidly expanded. So this is Simmel's description, an excerpt from The Metropolis and Mental Life. There is perhaps no psychic phenomenon which is so unconditionally reserved to the city as the blasé outlook. The essence of the blasé attitude is an indifference towards the distinctions between things, not in the sense that they are not perceived, as in the case of mental dullness, but rather that the meaning and the value of the distinctions between things and therewith of the things themselves are experienced as meaningless. They appear to the blasé person in a homogeneous, flat and grey colour, with no one of them worthy of being preferred to another. This psychic mood is the correct subjective reflection of a complete money economy to the extent that money takes the place of all the manifoldness of things and expresses all qualitative distinctions between them in the distinction of how much. To the extent that money, with its colourlessness and its indifferent quality, can become a common denominator of all values, it becomes the frightful leveller. It hollows out the core of things, their peculiarities, their specific values, and their uniqueness and incomparability in a way which is beyond repair. They all float with the same specific gravity in the constantly moving stream of money. They all rest on the same level and are distinguished only by their amounts. The nerves reveal their final possibility of adjusting themselves to the content and the form of metropolitan life by renouncing the response to them. So I'd ask you to focus on my favourite line. We'll say favourite. It's slightly downbeat. But this, where are we? They all float with the same specific gravity in the constantly moving stream of money. So Zimmel's describing how this new advent of a commodified society, which will be a major theme of today's talk. But this constantly moving stream of money, think how much more advanced in our digital society that's become. But I think what's interesting and why I chose this quotation to accompany this picture is the way in which, as we'll see as we go through, one of the things that gets caught up in that constantly moving stream of money and gets reduced, its difference, its manifoldness, gets reduced to just the common denominator of money, is this woman herself, and by extension, people within that type of economy. So I may sound like a raging Marxist at this point, but I would argue it is an element of Marxist analysis of capitalism. Alienation is something that even Adam Smith, one of the founders of, neoliberal economics, he recognized alienation. The classic example he gives in The Wealth of Nations is the manufacture of pins and how the division of labor massively increases productivity. But at the price of alienation, you're alienated. You never get to see your end product because you're only responsible for one tiny part. So it sounds, sorry to bring a load of economics into it, but this idea of alienation, I think it is a crucial element of what this painting's all about. So that was the first quotation. And then if I can read to you another one, I'll explain this. He was a writer at the time called Hippolyte Taine, and he wrote some satires on Parisian society, and he did it through the persona of an imaginary American oil magnate, Monsieur Frédéric Thomas Grandauge. So you've got this American in Paris, and Hippolyte Taine is describing the foreigner's experience of what Paris was like. And in this excerpt, the character Grandauge is describing how he sees the indifference, which I think builds upon the previous quotation, the indifference of the women that he encounters in Paris at this time. So here's the excerpt. Cleopatra's, the rottenness and culture of Egypt, forced into life 18 centuries ago, flowers as intoxicating and splendid, as sickly and dangerous as those of the Parisian compost heap from which we draw our vigour and our ills. At first sight, they are sphinxes. Look at them directly in the face. At 2 steps distance, they do not change countenance. Not a muscle quivers. With 3 opera glasses turned straight upon her, the youngest is motionless. She will not notice your presence. Not a blush comes to her forehead. Not a quiver to her lips. She goes on talking, looking about through her glass. She treats you as though you're only a wooden peg on which 3 pieces of black cloth are hanging. She is like a soldier in uniform under fire. The nerves are braced, but the front serene and head erect. But the hairdo, the robe, a bit of ribbon, a twisted curl, the lightest and most careless of the movements of her fan, each one has its voice, and each one cries out, I desire, I shall have more. I desire, and I shall have without limit and for always. So that was, they're the first two I've already read you. So you've got Zimmel's blasé attitude, this idea that how we all act when we find ourselves in a money economy. So at that time, 1880, I mentioned earlier in the Hollow Men video, the Haussmannisation of the boulevards, the massive, rapid modernization of Paris. I think from memory it was 1855 to 1870. Apologies if I got it was 1852, but it's not long after 1850, and it's until 1870 when the Franco-Prussian War broke out. So Paris was rapidly, people had come in from all over France to get work in Paris. I think at the time it was about 25 or 30% of the population were recent immigrants to the city from the outer reaches of France and the countryside. So Zimmel's describing the new changes in social attitudes that arise when this massive influx of new people. So you've lost any idea of Paris, little villages within Paris. You suddenly have this blasé attitude that Zimmel's writing about. And I described Hippolyte Tain's, his description of, it didn't quite fit. The picture you're looking at is obviously a woman who's working as a barmaid, but he's describing the general atmosphere, and we'll see in the following paintings women at these cafe concert venues with opera glasses, and you'll see, but whether this is one of the themes as well of this talk, whether they're spectators or people like this woman working at a bar, they all partake of this blasé attitude that Zimmel writes about. And then the other quotations I'll read as we go along later on in the talk. You've got Guy de Maupassant, his novel Bel Ami, and he describes the cafe concert environment. So I'll explain more in a little bit what these cafe concert places were like. But he describes in a novel of the time. And then you had two brothers, the Goncourts, and they wrote about another cafe concert place called El Dorado. So I'll give you they were like cultural commentators of the time. So they're writing non-fiction. And then to finish off, Zola, I mentioned Au Bonheur des Dames and Le Ventre de Paris. Ladies' Paradise in English, the translations are published as, and The Belly of Paris. And both of them in their different ways describe this sudden, what it's like to have lived in Paris, how novel it appeared to people at the time, this rapid urbanization. So without more ado, let's go back to the painting. I just want to make sure that you can see the maximum amount of the painting. Now, there are so many, and I'm sure I'll miss some things, so I get the strong suspicion that I'll come back to this painting. I'll circle around it in future videos, probably again and again and again. I'm absolutely fascinated by it. But I'll talk you through some of what I would suggest are the most significant features. So I will talk about, I think the main feature of this is the flatness. And what I'm going to do shortly is give you a series of other Manet paintings in which the flatness of the depiction of the contents of the painting, the technique whereby and the method whereby Manet does that. So if we leave that to one side, this key issue of flatness, which we'll come to shortly, there are various issues. So the most obvious one, and it most often commented upon it, the contemporaries of Manet, the art critics, basically panned him for this painting and said, typical impressionist, he couldn't be bothered to get the perspective right. So the reflection on the right hand side as we look at it, that isn't a realistic reflection if, as the eyes are looking at you, the viewer, you were stood right in front of this barmaid. You'd have to be standing much further to the left for you to be able to see that reflection. Now, Manet did study a oil study of this painting and decided, so with the correct perspective, with the correct reflection. And interestingly, the model he chose was more, this is a dated reference for British people, but if you remember Bet Lynch in Coronation Street, big, brash, blonde woman with her hair piled up high, that was the figure he had in the original oil study. And he changed it, A, to this woman, and B, he changed the perspective so that it looks odd, and in a sense, inverted commas, it doesn't work. So that is to say, he deliberately did this. It was no error on his part, and the critics of the time just didn't get it. So then you have to ask yourself, why? Why would he do that? And that's what we'll explore. So there are different ways to read this. I'll cut to the chase. My specific personal reading of this is that the real woman is actually the reflection in the mirror. That is the woman as a reflection of a living woman. Whereas the woman that you can see, the main subject of the painting, I think is not a mirage, but she's a figment of the imagination. She's either how the real woman in the reflection would like to see herself, or she's how the man talking to her idealizes her. And then you have the question of, well, who's the man that's talking to her? So if I can get the dreaded laser pointer. You've obviously got this man looking at her, and he's got the big phallic walking stick in his hand, which adds to the sexual connotations of the encounter. But you've also got over here a man who looks very, very like him. So I'd argue maybe an additional layer is he the same as this man? So that sound will, how can they be in two places at once? But this, I'll show you shortly a picture from Masaccio, from 1425 to 1428, they estimate. But, hundreds of years ago, there was a painting where a narrative unfolded in the painting. So I think it's St. Peter is seen on three separate occasions within the same painting. So that's just one thing to think about. I'm not claiming I'm right, but it strikes me that one reason, for example, that would add weight to what I'm claiming is if I can get rid of if you look here, she doesn't have, I could have called this talk the girl with the missing earring, because there's no earring there, and she has two what look like pearl earrings in the main image. she's also, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm trying to think of a polite word, but frumpy. She's not as neatly silhouetted, as tightly silhouetted as. So this is why I'm arguing this is an idealized image of this real woman. I can't see another reason why Manet was not stupid. Why did he deliberately, must have deliberately exclude this earring? And she's leaning over. There's obviously a very intense conversation. This strikes me as more real in a sense, and this strikes me as more idealized. So this goes to a major theme of this painting is the nature of spectacle, the way in which people become spectacles themselves. And in a commodity society, again, I think it's a quote from Marx. He had various quotes, but in Marx he has all that's solid melts into air, all that's holy is profaned. And he also refers at certain points to I think Walter Benjamin, who was a Marxist scholar who died in 1939, escaping the Nazis. But he had this notion of he wrote about Paris, he called it the Arcades Project in English. And he had this notion of a commodity culture as consisting of the phantasmagoria of commodities. So people begin to be seen as commodities, and in this type of cafe concert environment, prostitution, it was ambiguous because prostitution was quite common, but you never knew for sure if the serving girl in shops, in cafe concerts like this, all over Paris, because so many women had come in from the countryside and other parts of France for work, it was often very unclear whether sexual services were being offered. So it's generally recognised that's a subtext of this painting. And the painting is riddled with ambiguity. So any interpretation I offer, I'm not claiming it's right at all, because Manet, again, it's a common theme throughout this channel. Manet, as with other artists, they produce enigmatic works that are deliberately open for interpretation. So there's been commentators have said there's almost like a Mary Magdalene type persona of this barmaid figure, because on the one hand, the pose she's adopted, to contemporary eyes, it's not as obvious, but you see the bare upper arms. And there's even critics have commented upon this as the Mount of Venus. It's almost like a reference to the pubic area. Because I know I sound incredibly perverted, but in those times there was a weird. They had a very non-modern social mores about the exposure of arms. So if you see in the background here, this lady has her arms completely covered with long gloves. So very well-to-do ladies, the idea was you had to keep your arms and hands covered. But for example, you could show décolletage, you could show your heaving breasts and expose your neck, and that was much more acceptable. But to our eyes, it would be the opposite, I guess. So she's got these exposed, and it's in lots of Catholic iconography, there are lots of paintings of the Virgin Mary. There's a statue in Liverpool Catholic Cathedral where the Virgin Mary has her arms outstretched, standing very similar to this, I think, with a child in front of her. So the iconology is, on the one hand, she's showing too much flesh for the mores, the customs of that time. On the other hand, she's also, it's the Madonna whore paradox, she's also got these connotations of the Madonna. And then you've got So that contrasts, you've got ladies in the background. And you've got some fascinating... I'll see if I can just get rid of the... So if you see here, the lady to the right of the behatted lady with the yellowy orange gloves, golden gloves, I guess. What, she's looking almost directly at us with quite a disconcerting, so it's like a judgmental look. So yet another ambiguity of the painting is you can't see the reflection of the person who should be facing the barmaid, because the reflection is too far off to the right. You don't get to see the reflection that you would if someone was stood directly in front where the barmaid is looking. Whereas this woman with the looks like the gold mirrors slightly the gloves, but the woman to the right of the woman with the gloves looking at us, she's looking at someone who technically isn't there according to the way the painting's being constructed, yet she's looking directly at us. And then you've got the man to the left of the woman with the gold gloves, and he's looking at us. And I just think it's an amazing ability of Manet to get expression in eyes that don't exist, so you can't see in either of those figures eyes properly. But yet somehow he manages to give this sense that you're being looked at. So there's that element. I'll talk about the flatness in a second. Like I say, that's crucial. And then the other elements, there's been disagreement. Again, this is how ambiguous the painting is. If you see, if I go back and get the... If you see this, you see this white looks almost like smoke. And then you've got up here. And I think it's called, the technical term is scrumbling, this whitening effect. Now, one critic I was reading was saying, just assuming automatically, this is the dirt or dust, the scrumbling, the painting, the scrumbling, is designed to replicate the smudges on the mirror behind the barmaid. Now, that may be true, but also a possibility, these environments would be incredibly smoky. So there'll be lots of men with cigars, lots of men and women with cigarettes. Could it be, that's what that white dusting is? I haven't made my mind up. I honestly don't know. But then you've got, which it'll be a theme that I'll give examples of later, but the dehumanization of the barmaid, this notion of the blasé attitude is not just in her face. So it's a completely non-committed face. This is what Zimmel's writing about. This is one of the mental corollaries of the money economy. People start acting like this, not showing their emotions. Everything's brought down to the base level of money, the lowest common denominator. But her black bodice-like costume is mirrored to some extent by the bottles. There is the bangle on the arm matches or mirrors the gold of the tops of the champagne. You've got the flowers are mirrored. So in all art, the flowers are always a sign of transience, ephemerality. But the flowers are matched by the bodice there. The sleeve here has connotations of the labels on the bottles. And if you notice this sleeve here, the way the shape of the sleeve, and yet the reflection over here, that could only be if we're looking at the woman from this reflection here that you see could only be perspectively true if we were much further over to the left, because this is what it's representing. We're not seeing that directly behind her. So that's why Manet is deliberately confusing the point of view of the person looking at the barmaid, i.e. us, the viewer. Other parallels that make the woman almost objectify her. I mentioned the scrumbling. Well, that is the lace that she has all around her, both the cuffs and the top of her clothes here. And the chandeliers. So the chandeliers, the scrumbling, the reflections off the marble, the lace that she's wearing. It all gives quite this notion of the phantasmagorical. It all seems slightly unmoored. And also, you've got the glass here. They match slightly. The lace and the glass have slightly similar colouring. You've got the buttons coming down here, and there's highlights in the glass here. So there's lots of subtle matchings that are going on with objects. And most objectifying, maybe of all, and forgive the crudity, but this is of the time where, like I mentioned, prostitution was common. You've got the crotch area, you've got a definite triangle, and you've got the, apparently this is Bass, I knew it was Bass beer, I'm obsessed with my beer, but I didn't know the Bass beer, the famous red triangle, was, I think it was one of, if not definitely one of the first patented or copyrighted trademarks to advertise a product. So I think Manet is making that illusion. I think the fruit as well has always been a symbol in art for sexual availability, often a symbol for sexual availability. Then you've got, just to add to the confusion, all the ambiguities that I've been talking about, the reflections here just don't work. So these bottles here, you'd expect them to be at the front of the table as it's reflected in the mirror, but they're further back. That's just odd. And again, you see the reflection of this bottle that's between her arm and her body. That's going to be a reflection of one of these, but it just doesn't seem to match. And these all don't seem to have the depth that is being reflected back here. So it's all quite odd. And then, before I forget, you've got the oddness of the trapeze artist's legs up here, and again you've got so the trapeze artist is disembodied, you only see a bit of her, and those two legs, you could see the way in which you can see the skin of the woman's chest. The legs are almost replicated. The legs are almost replicated in the two arms. And you've got, I mentioned the gold and the bangle, you've got it's reddish gold hair, but you've then got, she's wearing a pendant. There's a lot gone into the painting to make the barmaid appear as just another commodity amongst these other. The fact that the bottles, there's several of them replicating each other. This all points to the notion of a commodity society. The commodities are replicated. And there's a story behind, apparently, Manet painted this in 1881, and I think he died, I think it was exhibited 1882, and I think he died 1883, and it was his last major work. And it's difficult to say. I think the consensus is that he was dying of tertiary syphilis. I think I've seen somewhere else claiming that it might have been multiple sclerosis, perhaps. But one of the problems was, A, tertiary syphilis was common in those days because of all the issues I've been discussing about prostitution. But B, it was also a very common diagnosis for all types of things. But by this stage of his life, he was dying, and he had, I think it was gangrene in one of his feet. So he basically painted this sitting down. And one of the suggestions is that the feet of the trapeze artist are an allusion to mobility that he no longer has as an artist. And also there's the nostalgia that this is the type of environment he would have been in when he was a younger, more mobile man. So in that sense, the gentleman on the right, who could be propositioning the barmaid, is a alter ego of Manet himself, as he would like to still be able to be, in a sense. I'm trying to think of anything else, because I'll talk about, like I say, the flatness and the shallowness in a second. I'm trying to think of any more details I've missed, or... No, that's quite a lot to be going on with. But I hope you'd accept that just a closer look reveals so much in that painting. And one of the things, so we've just looked into the depth. The mirror is used by Manet brilliantly. You know, the mirror takes up nearly the whole of the painting. But this is much more common. So this is an earlier painting by Ingres, but you see how the mirror offers very little extra detail. It's a relatively minor aspect of Ingres' the whole painting. Another example of this would be Tissot. I think he was originally called Jean-Jacques Tissot, but he spent some time in London and anglicised his name, and then lost his partner and came back to France, but he kept the James. But again, you see how what's arguably very novel about Manet's use of the mirror is the way he makes it almost like a central character of the whole painting. And then regarding my theory about, you know, who is the figment of whose imagination in that painting, this is the Masaccio painting I mentioned from they estimate 1425 to 1428. And this is St. Peter. I think it's called Money Tribute, and the idea is that Christ has stopped with his disciples and asked to pay the taxman. So even Christ couldn't avoid the dreaded taxman. That's the only certainties are death and taxes, remember. So there we have St. Peter, and the idea is that he's asked to pay the taxman, and Christ told him to go and take, there's a coin in a fish's mouth is the idea of the story. But this is also the same St. Peter. And then this is St. Peter paying the taxman. So the point I'm making is that it's almost like a cartoon strip, but the narrative is contained within the one plane of the painting. So I'm suggesting that Manet showing something that isn't actually possible in real time isn't necessarily so far-fetched. You know, there's a precedent from a good 450 years earlier. And then again, just to give some more visual context, the Folies Bergère painting. This is another Tissot on the Thames. And this relates to the theme of objectification of women that I'm going to develop as well. So it's like, it just reminds me of, for UK viewers, the brightly wrapped chocolates, or candy as North Americans would call it, called Quality Street. And the woman is it's, you know, to modern contemporary eyes looks ridiculous, but it's almost dressed up like confectionery. And then Tissot has this. I don't think he's nowhere near the standard of Manet, and but the irony is, Manet and many of his contemporaries didn't. You know, they had some professional recognition, but very few of them made much money. Whereas Tissot was arguably much worse at painting technically and imaginatively, and people absolutely adored his paintings, and he made an absolute fortune. So there's a lesson there. If you've got no money, it's because you're too good, Paul tells himself. But the way in which the boatman is looking, and the other boatman seems to be looking at him, and there's lots of Tissot paintings where there are not even lascivious looks, because in some of his paintings there are widows, and men are looking. They're dressed in black with a chaperone, and men are looking, and it's quite subtle. It's obviously they're looking to see whether they have a chance, but it's not overtly lascivious either. But the idea I'm trying to convey is that lots of newly available women in Paris, this is part of the general atmosphere, where women are basically, in some senses, mannequins for expensive clothes that men like to see them in. So this is the general climate that we're talking about. And this is another, it was from his series La Femme à Paris, The Shop Girl. And I want to read you something to accompany this, which is, it's by Soren Kierkegaard, and it's in a book called Either Or. Soren Kierkegaard has an essay called The Diary of a Seducer. And if you can find it online, or even better, obviously buy the book, but Kierkegaard is not an easy read. But there, I think in that particular section, Diary of a Seducer, he gives a brilliant portrayal of a man who's followed. The man is trying to aestheticize his leeriness, his leering, in this case, definitely lascivious approach to women. And he tries to aestheticize it and make it into almost like poetic form of pursuit. And there's a description in which he follows a young woman, a 17-year-old girl, into a shop, and he observes her in a mirror. And at some future date, it reminds me of two Hitchcock films. One is Vertigo, in which the main character follows, I think it's Kim Novak, the female actress, in a flower shop, and the James Stewart character is hiding behind a door, and we see him looking through the crack of the door, and alongside him is the mirror that he can't see that reflects Kim Novak. So he's looking at Kim Novak, and then we also see the reflection. When we see him, we see the reflection of Kim Novak in this absolutely stunning array of flowers in this flower shop. And then the other, because the thing I'm going to read you is all about the notion of desire and distance, and the other, I will do for definite a video on Hitchcock's Rear Window, in which when the female character goes across a courtyard, suddenly, again, it's James Stewart as the male actor and Grace Kelly as the female actor. When she goes across the courtyard, that's when he begins to desire her, because she's suddenly in the frame, so to speak, of his desire. When she's in the apartment with him, she's too close. So it's a very involved, psychologically complex variant on the idea of absence makes the heart grow fonder in one sense. So this is the excerpt from Kierkegaard's, it's 1843, and in part one of Either Or, there's a section called The Seducer's Diary, and it's a protagonist who's not named, and he's spying on this woman. So this is what's written. As yet, she has not seen me. I am standing at the other end of the counter, far off by myself. There is a mirror on the opposite wall. She is not contemplating it, but the mirror is contemplating her. How faithfully it has caught her image, like a humble slave who shows his devotion by his faithfulness. A slave for whom she certainly has significance, but who has no significance for her, who indeed dares to capture her, but not to hold her. Unhappy mirror, which assuredly can grasp her image, but not her. Unhappy mirror, which cannot secretly hide her image in itself, hide it from the whole world, but can only disclose it to others, as it now does to me. What torture if a human being were fashioned in that way? And yet, are there not many people who are like that, who possess nothing except at the moment when they are showing it to others, who merely grasp the surface, not the essence, lose everything when this is going to show itself, just as this mirror would lose her image if she were to disclose her heart to it by a single breath. And if a person were unable to possess an image in recollection at the very moment of presence, he must ever wish it to be at a distance from beauty, not so close that the mortal eyes cannot see the beauty of that which he holds in his embrace, and which the external eyes have lost, which he, to be sure, can regain for the external vision by distancing himself from it, but which he can, in fact, have before the eye of his soul, when he cannot see the object because it is too close to him, when lips are clinging to lips. How beautiful she is! Poor mirror, it must be tormenting. So I've chosen that because that actually also relates directly to the Folies Bergère painting. Because what that is about, in a certain sense, is even if the barmaid is an object, a sexual object to be purchased, if she's a part-time prostitute, the look on her face, the blasé attitude that Zimmel writes about, is the way in which even in that transaction she cannot be fully obtained. She can't be fully bought. So one of the major themes of the painting and the society in which it's taking place is that it was rapidly becoming a society of spectacles, images, visions that could be enjoyed as commodity experiences. So these cafe concert places where gymnastics, singing, music would be performed, and everybody's watching everyone, and the spectators are also becoming they're almost part of the spectacle itself. Everyone's looking at everyone else, which again I'll show you in a quotation shortly. So I just think it's, like I said, Kierkegaard is not an easy read. But the way in which in that quotation he addresses the relationship between distance and longing. And he talks about when lips are clinging to lips, that because when he says the object because it is too close to him, when lips are clinging to lips. At the very beginning of Rear Window, Grace Kelly leans in to kiss James Stewart. and the camera angle, she's incredibly close, and her face just appears as this big blot. And that is Hitchcock's almost direct illustration of what Kierkegaard is talking about in 1843. So Hitchcock's approximately 110 years later in his film. It's very closely illustrating what Kierkegaard is writing about. And then, the whole idea of, in the original Folies Bergère painting, it's all about mirrors. So if we move back to it, that quotation also has obvious relevance to the context that all of this is being represented by Manet in the form of a huge mirror. So there's the man on the right desiring the woman, and there's this idealized mirror image. And then just the genius of the painting is we're seeing the image in front of us. Behind the barmaid are all these spectators. But in reality, because this is a mirror, they are actually behind us, the viewer. So they're simultaneously behind us and in front of us. So it's very disorientating if you try and get your head around what's going on and all the previous themes I've mentioned. Just layer upon layer upon layer. Now, if I can also give you some more background. So I've already given you some social context. And here's some more. So this is from Guy de Maupassant's novel Belle Amie. And the hero of the novel is a guy called Forestier. Put my teeth back in. Forestier. And this excerpt is actually set at the Folies Bergère. So Forestier is with his friend Duroy. And this is how the segment reads. Duroy hardly bothered at all with the spectacle on stage, and turning his head, he kept his eyes fixed on the great gallery behind him, full of men and prostitutes. Forestier said to him, "Notice the orchestra stalls. Nobody there but bourgeois with their wives and children, good stupid souls who come for the show. In the boxes, boulevard types, a few artists, a few women from the demi-monde. And behind us, the most bizarre mixture in all of Paris. Who are these men? Look at them closely. They are of all types, of every profession and caste. But the scum predominates. Look at the clerks from the banks, the stores, the ministries. Look at the reporters, the pimps, the officers in mufti, the toffs in evening dress who have just eaten in some tavern and have slipped out of the opera on their way to the Boulevard des Italiens. And then again, a whole world of dubious men who defy analysis altogether. And as for the women, there is only one kind, the kind that eats supper at the Americain, the 40-franc whore who lies in wait for the foreigner with 100 francs to spend and tips off her friends when she is free. So the point is, Forestier and his friend Duroy, they're not even interested in what's going on at the cafe concert. All they want to look at are the people looking at the spectacles. So it's consumers enjoying spectacles of consumption being looked at by other consumers, and that's the ultimate spectacle, is all these people in this social space. And here's the the Goncourts, this is the excerpt from the Goncourts, they're describing El Dorado, which is another place, a competitor to the Folies Bergère. At the El Dorado, a big circular room with 2 tiers of boxes, all gilt and painted with false marble, dazzling chandeliers, a cafe inside the room, black with men's hats, bonnets of women from the Barrière, children in military kepi hats belonging to prostitutes in company with shop assistants. Sorry, I'll read that again. Children in military kepis, and then hats belonging to prostitutes in company with shop assistants, pink ribbons on the women in the boxes, the breadth of all this crowd visible, a cloud of dust and tobacco smoke. Towards the back, a theatre stage with footlights, and on it, a comic in evening dress. He sang disconnected things, interspersed with chortling and farmyard noises, the sounds of animals in heat, epileptic gesticulations, a Saint Vitus's dance of idiocy. The audience went wild with enthusiasm. I may be wrong, but it seems to me we are heading for a revolution. There is a rottenness and stupidity in the public, a laughter so unwholesome that it will take a great upheaval, the spilling of blood, to clear the air and make even comedy sanitary. So the second part of that quotation is obviously about the perceived diminishing of public taste. So the Goncourts hadn't seen Big Brother and all the reality TV descendants. But the first part of that quotation, I hope you could see just the obvious relevance to the Folies Bergère painting. The breath of all this crowd visible, a cloud of dust and tobacco smoke. The big circular room, all gilt and painted with false marble, dazzling chandeliers, black with men's hats. All these issues are very similar. So this is, Foucault argues there are 3 key features of Manet. And I'll give you examples now of this notion of the flatness and the use of shallow space. Also, within Manet's paintings, he very rarely gives any sense of illumination that's artfully done. So in Vermeer, when you look at the Vermeer video I did, there's always, or often, there's light coming in from the side, artfully done. That type of illumination, the illumination you've seen in the Folies Bergère painting, is much flatter. And then we've already seen the ambiguous position of the viewer. So with those 3 ideas in mind, here are some visual examples. So this is a masked opera. And notice in the previous quote the idea about the black hats. So you've got the repetition of the black hats and almost like a wave. But the sense of shallowness, you've got the verticality of the columns. And you've got the horizontal. And this is a classic Manet type technique. He creates a sense of shallowness and lack of depth by these vertical and horizontal lines. And you've got the repetition of the black hats. You've got the desubjectification of the people wearing masks. The other thing Manet was often accused of was killing the subject. In other words, taking away the subjectivity, making people appear as just part of a crowd, which obviously in here. And to the extent that there's a level above this level, and you can only see their legs, so they're more anonymized. And you get the sense of its layer after layer of humanity. And these, like I said, this wave, this sea of black hats. And then on the left-hand side, or 2/3 to the left, this, it obviously looks like a proposition of some type, but the way all the women are basically being looked at as objects. This was a painting called The Fifer, and this illustrates the concept of the illumination. It's incredibly flat, and there's no obvious light source, and it's almost like a cardboard cutout. The way that the lack of any type of perspective. This is what Manet manages to achieve. And then, if you want to talk about killing the subject, but again, the shallowness, the lack of depth in here, there is depth. There's a background behind the wall, but the wall behind the people being executed, this is the execution of Emperor Maximilian, that almost acts as yet another canvas within a canvas. It's like the background to the painting. But it creates this sense of shallowness. And again, the strong vertical and horizontal, the verticality provided by the number of soldiers and the horizontality of the wall, very strong. And this was, I think, in French, Le Chemin de Fer, the railway station. And I think there's also Gare les Arts. It's also referred to as. And again, you see the way in which the vertical railings and the horizontal lines, there is a depth behind, again, but the smoke, the steam from the railway station, you're told there's depth, but then it's simultaneously blocked off to you. And the governess, or whoever she is looking at us, but the girl is looking in a different direction, and the dog is obviously either asleep or looking completely off to the left. But again, very strong sense of shallowness. And this was the balcony. And this is again like the wall in the execution of Emperor Maximilian. This time there's a room behind them, but it's so dark you can barely make out there's a man looking out. So there's a man between the two women, but there's also in the background another man. And very dark room. So that acts, there's some point about, again, it's almost like the darkness of the room, rather than that window providing an ability to see in, which is what windows normally do. Even though the shutters are open, all you can see is into the darkness, and the darkness acts as almost another canvas. And you've got the lines, the horizontal and the vertical lines, yet again, of the railing. And then if you notice on the right-hand side, the foot of the young girl, it's hovering. It's the way in which Manet produces this notion of things in suspension. There's no solidity. It's this odd sense of suspension. So sorry. Most clumsy hands in human existence. Look. That'll do. But having seen all those examples of the shallowness, can you see now the barmaid is trapped? There's the gilt edge of the mirror as one boundary, and then there's the marble, the counter, and she's trapped in what seems to be a very narrow space. And yes, there's a background, but remember, it's a mirrored background, so it's not a real background. And you've got again, the horizontal balcony and the pillars coming down, the horizontal lines and the straight lines, which help the sense of shallowness. You've got the flatness of the almost like the moon-like lanterns. And I think there's a lantern just behind the trapeze. So there's lots of interruptions as well, as the other thing I'd say. So the bottles are interrupted by and interrupt the reflected marble top. The arm interrupts these bottles. I've already mentioned the trapeze there interrupting the globe in the background. The arm here being interrupted by this glass container, our sense of what's going on interrupted by this non-perspectival couple in the background. The barmaid interrupting our uncluttered view of the mirror, and with the the look that interrupts us. So you could argue there's a series of interruptions. And then I just mentioned the foot in the previous painting, but the way in which the reflection of the marble counter, there's no obvious way in which it almost seems to levitate. You don't see anything grounding it or connecting it to the ground. Likewise, in some sense, the balcony. So you've got these things going on, all these interruptions. It's almost like a collage of objects plastered on, because any sense of depth is constantly being interrupted. And you've got the way in which he uses the horizontal and the vertical again. And you've got the sense of almost like the levitating marble. And you've got the sense of the smoke and the reflections of the marble and the phantasmagorical. And I think some critics said he hadn't got the lighting right, because electrical lights were just being used in public spaces. And there was lots of observations by cultural commentators about the glare, how incredibly bright these lights were for the sensibilities of the people at the time. But I'd argue that he's created almost like this misty effect, because it adds to the phantasmagorical element of the whole thing. So I'll finish with this, the final look at the whole painting. And I'll read you a couple of excerpts that I've developed this idea of the woman being objectified. And to do this painting justice, I could do probably another 2 or 3 videos, which you'd be chuffed to hear, I'm sure. But the way in which, if you want to think about, when people talk, it's quite an abstract term, the objectification of women. But I've given you some indicators as to how this painting represents it. And then in the couple of quotes I'm going to give you, these are again from Zola, his novels, Lady's Paradise and The Belly of Paris. And they both explicitly describe the way in which this process of objectification was taking place. And remember, this is Zola's writing at approximately around about I think he plays with the chronology of when these places are actually existing and when he was writing about them in his novels as existing. But remember, this is 1881. And I'm heavily suggesting that this is an epoch, this is a time. The demi-monde of Paris, this was when this process of commodification, this process of objectifying women, you can see it's quite blatant, the process by which it happens. So, assuming I can find the right glasses and I can find the right excerpts, I'll just finish. I'll say goodbye, and you can see the painting for the last time, and I'll read you out these 2 quotes that I think summarize this objectification argument. So this first quotation, it's from Zola's Au Bonheur des Dames, Lady's Paradise is the English translation. And Mouret is a department store magnate who's incredibly ambitious throughout the novel. And Le Bon Marché, I think, is the department store that the novel is based upon, and Le Bon Marché was a real store in Paris. And this excerpt refers to the glittering mirrors on all the sides of these huge main galleries. So these glittering mirrors, and this is where it begins, carried the departments back into infinite space, reflecting the displays with portions of the public, faces reversed, and halves of shoulders and arms, whilst to the right and to the left, the lateral galleries opened up other vistas, the snowy background of the linen department, the speckled depth of the hosiery one, distant views illuminated by the rays of light from some glazed bay, and in which the crowd appeared nothing but a mass of human dust. And then from the same novel, oh, sorry, this is from the Le Ventre de Paris, where there's a brand new, stupendously lavish delicatessen is opened. And there's a similar sense of what's going on with mirrors. So this is the quote. And I think Lisa is the owner-manager. From an immense square mirror on the ceiling, surrounded by an elaborately gilded and ornamented cornice, hung a crystal chandelier with 4 branches. Over the whole of the wall panel behind the counter and at the left-hand side, and also at the end of the shop, were other mirrors, pools of light let into marble frameworks, which had the effect of doors opening into other halls to infinity, all filled with an endless display of meats. And then he describes later on, standing on the glass shelf in the bright glow of the mirror, these flasks appeared as though they were suspended in the air, which I'm suggesting is what I've been talking about, the way in which Manet presents things as being suspended. And then the final quote, to which I'll get my face out the way and you can just enjoy the painting. But it's, as usual with me, it's quite a dark end to one of my talks. And I think it resonates with again, it's this Lisa woman who's the owner of the delicatessen, and she's being looked at by this guy Florent, and he can't bring himself to look at her directly, so he looks at her secretly in the reflection of the mirrors that are in the shop. And there's obviously a very close parallel with what I read you from Kierkegaard, the Diary of a Seducer. So he's looking at a reflection in the mirrors, and this is where the quote begins, in which her back and face and profile were reflected. The mirror on the ceiling too reflected her head with its tightly rolled coil of hair behind, and the little bands over her temples. Florence seemed to be gazing at a perfect crowd of Lisas, some of whom displayed the breadth of their shoulders, some their powerful-looking arms, and others their round, full breasts, so peaceful and reposeful as to be incapable of arousing a single carnal thought. Pieces of pork and of bacon fat were hanging from hooks along the whole line of mirrors and marbles, and Lisa's profile, with her strong neck, curvy lines, and swelling bosom, suggested an effigy of a queen hung up among the lard and raw meat.